Thank you very much. Really appreciate your stirring and powerful words. Thank you, Wheaton, for this very kind invitation to be here with you this afternoon. I'm trying to set up my own audio here, if that's okay. No, I'll put it up in just a few minutes. If we can just
Could you mute the screen for a bit? Thank you.
This topic that I will be tackling is the racialization and the nationalization of the image of God. I will be able to build strongly on Dr. Jennings, who is my mentor advisor at Duke University. So you will hear his voice coming through in some portions of my presentation. I'll begin by reflecting on a trip to Ferguson, Missouri that I made at the end of last year. So I'll just kind of read through my experience and my thoughts on that at the very beginning. In the quiet St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, Missouri, the dead body of Michael Brown, an 18-year-old African-American man, lay roasting in the midday heat of an August day. Accounts vary, but an encounter between a white police officer and a black youth resulted in the death and desecration of a black body and the ignition of a national debate on the worth of black lives to American society. So that the waning months of 2014 and into 2015, on the heels of two non-indictments and the slaying of black men, protests throughout the nations were raised asserting that black lives matter. Rodney King, Oscar Grant, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Demir Rice, and now Walter Scott are part of a long list of black victims of violence at the hands of law enforcement. They are victims of an American narrative that seems to devalue black souls, black lives, black bodies, and black minds. So in the process of our engagement with the doctrine of the image of God, we are confronted with the question, how has a dysfunctional theological imagination contributed to a sociological reality that necessitates a Black Lives Matter campaign? How has a misreading of the image of God in the American evangelical narrative elevated the dominant race and culture over and against other races and culture? Maybe we begin by thinking through that the power of Christian theology is the power to engage in a transcendent imagination, that the ability to see beyond our immediate context and to see God and see others through a lens of a transcendent imagination is a strength that we have as Christians. But that strength can also be a weakness because the capacity for a transcendent vision can lead to a sense of arrogance, a sense of privilege that is assumed by those who believe they possess this type of vision. And that it could lead to the assumption that because we have this transcendent imagination, we hold a unique and preferred position before God. And this sense of exceptionalism is part of the problem of the racialization and the nationalization of the image of God. There's much work done on this idea of the prophetic imagination. Willie Jennings writes about the imaginative capacity to redefine the social. Walter Brueggemann talks about the prophetic imagination. The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. Bill Kavanaugh also talks about this social theological imagination that can transform the individual and society. The reality of the broken world that we live in, as has been described in the previous session, means that we oftentimes engage not in a healthy theological imagination, but a dysfunctional one. And that this warped, dysfunctional imagination has often projected whiteness as normative and has given the power of white Christianity to project a negative image of the other. So let's talk about this racialization as an act of sinfulness, the committing of sin through the project of racialization of the image of God. Sin is very simply defined for many of us as the act of taking God's place in created order, that we as human beings put ourselves as the standard that replaces God's standards. And so if we believe that the standard in Scripture and standard in our theological understanding is that every human being is made in the image of God, the sin of racism undermines that expression. that the full image of God is found in only certain individuals or in certain people groups and not in all people groups. And so the distortion of this image of God in American Christianity is that oftentimes there is an elevation of the dominant culture, the dominant race, and a privileged position over others. Again, the usurping of God's rightful determination and the replacement of his standards with our own. This type of sinfulness, as I mentioned earlier, has oftentimes been expressed in the racialization and nationalization of a type of exceptionalism. An exceptionalism that elevates one culture over the other, and that's found first in a racialized version, but also in a nationalized version, maybe a belief in American exceptionalism or an American Christian exceptionalism. And that we see tied into this American exceptionalism the narrative of triumphalism as well. And I would identify these things as a sin rooted in the racialization and nationalization of the image of God. I'll go over 4 categories where we also see this racialization and nationalization. And again, I'm drawing very heavily from Dr. Jennings' work on this, and I will reference his work to say if you want to explore this topic further, his work will get you there. The first category is the belief, and this was already established in our previous session, the belief that white bodies are superior to non-white bodies, or particularly black bodies. And I won't go into detail because our second session today was already covering this topic, the assumption of superiority of white bodies over and against non-white bodies. But the categories extend. It's not just about white bodies or white flesh, but it is also about the assumed superiority of white minds over and against non-white minds. And I'll give you one particular example of this, and that is the product of white minds, particularly in the area of language. That how we understand the use of language is oftentimes indicative of our assumptions of white superiority in terms of the white mind over and against non-white minds. John Walensky writes that English is not taught as a second language, but as the only medium of intelligible communication. To acquire the English language is to have a stake in its claim as a world language. It is to be a party to a history that runs from the colonial past that first planted English across the globe. The linguistic chauvinism embodied in this notion of the native speaker sustains a colonizing the vision of the world. I would argue that Walensky is not only speaking about a globalization of English, but also maybe in evangelical missions or in the Christian academy as well. That the language of English is the primary language of any theological discourse. That English is the means by which we enter into the creative access necessary to go into non-Western worlds. That oftentimes when we first talked about going into nations that had previously been closed, our first go-to was we will go as English teachers. One of the primary narratives developing when we talked about mission work to Mongolia and to China was we will send English language teachers who will be who will be disguised as missionaries. I'm told of an Asian American pastor who was candidating within a denomination. And he is an English speaker, native English speaker, but he also happens to speak Mandarin. And a denominational official told him as he was candidating in many rural churches and churches that were overwhelmingly Anglo in makeup, that he really shouldn't write down on his resume that he was familiar with Mandarin or that he could speak it, because that might actually hurt his chances. That what he should do is just say, I'm a native English speaker, and not actually mention that he's a Mandarin speaker as well. The assumption of the superiority of white minds and white language over and against non-white languages and minds. A third category, the assumption of the superiority of white culture over and against non-white culture. The first book that I read in seminary was a book about church and culture and the relationship to theology. And after I read that book, I almost left seminary because I was so offended by this particular book. I won't mention the name of the book. You'll be able to figure this out when I start talking about it. The book talked about something called high culture. And the way high culture was defined was Aristotle, Rembrandt, Bach, Downton Abbey. No, that's not true. And this high culture was contrasted with something called low culture. And low culture was Andy Warhol's paintings, television sitcoms, Bon Jovi, Michael Jackson. What does he know about music if he's putting Michael Jackson in low culture? So he had these categories of high culture and low culture. And it was a way of saying, okay, we're going to grade culture for using a number of different categories. But I think as he was writing this book, he realized I'm missing a category here, which is every other cultures in the world was not categorized. So a third category was created called folk culture. And everything else got dumped into the category of folk culture. African American spirituals, Korean fan dancing, Native American regalia and drum circles. All of these things fell into the very large category of folk culture. And it was implied pretty clearly that folk culture was not quite as good as European high culture. It was better than pop culture and low culture, but not quite as good as high culture. Virginia Dominguez writes that any positive reference to culture almost always implies a European and Eurocentric culture, which they claim as their own, and in contrast to which they disparage others. The supremacy or superiority of white culture over and against non-white culture. And maybe the fourth category is the one we want to talk about more as an ongoing issue, the assumption of supremacy, superiority of white theology over and against non-white theology. And the best way I can describe this is that when I engage in a theological dialogue with others, I never hear of an adjectival marker describing Western theology. It's just theology. It's the norm. It's the center. But there's always an adjectival marker for non-white theology. There is black theology. There is liberation theology. There is Minjung theology. And so we assume a normative position for Western theology, and they clearly do not need to designate them as a Western theology. They are just theology. It is just theology. But we always put an adjectival marker in other expressions of theology. These issues of an assumption of superiority of white bodies, white minds, white culture, and white theology over and against non-white or non-Western expressions of Christianity. And again, I go back to Dr. Jennings' work. White indicates high salvific viability. White indicates high salvific viability. And that high salvific viability is oftentimes associated with our approximation of whiteness. And I want to pick up on that theme when I give you some historical examples here. So, what happens in the trajectory of Western evangelicalism or American evangelicalism when we have established that white is normative and that approximation to whiteness is what determines salvific viability or maybe your viability within the boundaries of evangelicalism. I was planning to give 4 examples. I will give 2. The first 2 I will refer to other works that will be helpful. The first example of this racialization and nationalization of the image of God is Stephen Newcomb's work, where he discovers in Pagans in the Promised Land the doctrine of discovery, where the image of God is distorted in such a way that allows for the conquest of a non-Western world by the European colonialists. Stephen Newcomb's work, and of course Dr. Jennings' works, The Christian Imagination, which has a wonderful section discussing the distorted imagination that leads to the slave trade. So those are 2 historic examples of the racialization and nationalization of the image of God. But the 2 examples that I will cover with you today is 1, the American evangelical relationship to the city and ministry in the urban context, and how that ministry and engagement oftentimes has a racialized narrative. And the second example is the work or the rise and the emergence of black evangelicals or African American evangelicals in the 1960s and 1970s, and how their narrative reflects, again, the racialization and nationalization of the image of God. Let's begin with the question of how have American evangelicals engaged the city, and how is that a reflective of the way that the way that whites look at the world is oftentimes determinative of how the rest looks at the world. In other words, who gets to decide what and who reflects the image of God or not? And I would argue that it has been mostly Western white Christianity that makes that decision. The dominion over creation. The dominion to declare things as right or wrong, the dominion to declare things as, and to name these things, has oftentimes been determined by Western white evangelicals. So we can begin with this question of how have Americans or American Christians viewed the cities in the United States? Well, the first example is one that most of us are familiar with. When John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, is at the Massachusetts Bay, and he looks out at what will become the city of Boston. And he says he envisions a city set on a hill. That's why if you were to go to the city of Boston, you have places like Beacon Hill and Beacon Street as a reflection of this idea that the new world, the North American continent, the soon-to-be United States of America, these cities in the United States of America, they're going to be cities set on a hill. New Zions and New Jerusalems found in the New World. William Klepsch notes that the vision of the New World as locus for a new city, the New World prompted Christians from the 16th to the 19th century to think of America as the last and best of human societies following the westward course of empire. So we see the image of American cities as cities set on a hill, New Zions and New Jerusalems. Harvey Kahn writes that New England was seen as the center of the new religious life, Christian life, and New England was seen as a New Jerusalem. That image begins to change, and it begins to change when the cities begin to change. We first encounter industrialization, where the cities become industrialized, and with the Industrial Revolution, we now have a high rate of urbanization. So more and more people are moving into our urban centers. And that's coupled with the migration and immigration of non-Anglos into our urban centers. We're familiar with these stories. The first is the story of the Eastern and Southern European coming to the United States, coming to, passing by Great Lady Liberty, coming into Staten Island and being processed in the ports, moving into the urban centers of New York and Boston, forming their own communities. And these folks are not Anglo-Protestants. They're not Northern or Western European Protestants. They're Italian Catholics. They're Polish Jews. They're Slavic Orthodox. They're from all over Southern and Eastern Europe, and they're not bringing Protestant faith with them. They are bringing other faiths, Catholics, Orthodox, Judaism. Robert Orsi notes that in the feverish imagination of antebellum anti-Catholic literary provocateurs, city neighborhoods appeared as caves of rum and Romanism, mysterious and forbidding, a threat to democracy. So these cities that were once cities set on a hill, when the dominant culture looks at these cities and all of a sudden their neighbors are no longer white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, they are now Roman Catholic, they are now Greek Orthodox, they are now Polish Jews, the narrative of the city begins to change. The city is no longer Jerusalem, the city is now Babylon. And this is amplified with what happens post-Civil War all the way through into post-World War II, which is the story of not only immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, but the story of the Great Migration, where African Americans from the Mississippi Delta moved from the South into the northern cities. Cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland have a huge influx of African Americans moving into these urban centers. Isabel Wilkerson writes that after World War II, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and other northern and western cities would witness a fitful migration of whites out of their urban strongholds. The far-out precincts in the inner-ring suburbs became sanctuaries for battle-weary whites seeking, with government incentives, to replicate the havens they once had in these cities. The cities that were once cities set on a hill, New Jerusalems and New Zions, now they were places of rum and Romanism, places where white flight was happening in a very significant way. So the cities are now identified as Babylons, and there is a New Jerusalem, and that's the suburbs. The suburbs are the New Jerusalems. The suburbs are the places where you will build nice Christian colleges. The suburbs are the places where you will have mega churches. And white flight could be theologically justified. After all, we don't want to live in Babylon. We don't want to live in the center of all that is evil in the world, so we must flee to the suburbs. Think again, the racialization of the image of God. Who gets to determine what's Jerusalem and what's Babylon? Who gets to say this place is okay to live in and this place is not? The gaze, the dominant gaze, determines that narrative. So the whites move from the city to the suburbs. There is a theological justification. After all, why would we live in Babylon? We need to move to the new Jerusalems in the suburbs. And these churches actually grow. Winthrop Hudson notes that in the year 1945, $26 million were spent on new church buildings. That sounds like a lot. But get this, 15 years later, by 1960, after this massive white flight occurs, $1 billion were spent on new buildings. So in 15 years, the new building budget goes from $26 million to $1 billion. Why? Because whites had left the urban neighborhoods. They had abandoned a lot of these churches, moved to the suburbs, and were building beautiful buildings out in the suburbs post-World War II. Now, the question then is, well, they were building these buildings because the churches were growing. Yes, the churches were growing because everybody moved to the suburbs. This was not conversion growth. That's one of the concerns about, well, there's so much conversion growth in these suburban churches. Herbert Gans did a study on Levittown, which is one of these quintessential suburban communities that spring up post-World War II. And he was tracking church attendance and found that actually there really wasn't a change in terms of church attendance. In other words, people who were going to church in the city were now going to church in the suburbs. People who were not going to church in the city were not going to church in the suburbs. The churches in the suburbs were growing because they had moved from the city to the suburbs. It's sort of like there was a New York Times article a few years ago that was tracking the growth of the church in the exurbs, which is even further out from the suburbs. And in the exurbs, they talked about these churches that literally sprang up overnight. There was nobody there. You know some of these communities. There's nobody there. It's cornfield after cornfield. And within about 2 or 3 years, all these subdivisions and suburban tracts show up. These gated communities pop up. Well, it turns out that churches, innovative, capitalistic thinking church pastors, move into these communities and church plant. And overnight, their churches go from 0 to 2,000. And they write a book later on how to grow your church from 0 to 2,000. Because they're moving into neighborhoods that didn't have churches 10 years ago. They didn't have people 10 years ago. And now that the people that have moved, they bring their Christian faith to the suburbs, and these churches in the suburbs grow. Denison Nash and Peter Berger did a study several years ago on, I'm trying to remember the notes. The title of the works are two different works. The Child, the Family, and the Religious Revival in Suburbia. And the second one is, And a Little Child Should Lead Them, a test of an hypothesis that children were the source of the American religious revival. So the growth of the church is one, transfer growth from the city to the suburbs, and the growth of the church was because these suburban families were having children and leading to the growth of the church in the suburbs. But that perpetuates this idea that the suburbs are the new Jerusalem. We did right by moving out to the suburbs. It was the right choice to leave Babylon, the evil city, and move in to the suburbs and to form a new Jerusalem, a new Zion in these suburbs. And it also justified a lot of the church growth techniques, chief among them the homogeneous unit principle. Well, let's build churches that are built for people that are like us. And we will attract people that are like us into these suburban churches and grow these churches. After all, we are the new Jerusalem. One of the more prominent church growth books has an image of a church, it's a church in the suburbs of Southern California. I'm not going to go into more detail than that. A suburb of Southern California, and there's an image of the book that he wrote about this is the kind of person that we want. And it was a 40-year-old white male with khaki pants and a golf shirt and a cell phone in one hand. He said, this is the person we were trying to attract to the church. The image of the person we want at our church, which leaves out a whole lot of other people and not allowed to come to that church. And so the homogeneous unit principle began to find a theological justification. After all, if the cities are Babylon and the suburbs are Jerusalem, then it justifies these actions. Whose gaze determines what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. And there's another part to the story. There's a third part. You not only get the city seen as Jerusalem initially and then move to the narrative of Babylon, and the new place of Jerusalem is the suburbs, you now get this new phenomenon, recent phenomenon, of gentrification, the return to the city. And not only of empty nesters, not only of young people, but Christians and churches now want to return to the city. And the problem there is that the gaze, the image, still is retained from a previous generation. So the suburbs are still the New Jerusalem, and the cities are still Babylon, and what it does is it shapes the narrative of what we're going to do in the cities. So I thought one of the best ways to illustrate this is to look at, and we can put the slides up here, of book covers. Book covers on urban ministry. Can we put the full screen up? Book covers on urban ministry. Book covers on urban ministry, and these are roughly in chronological order, by the way. So we know the story of the city set on a hill, New Jerusalem and New Zion. But then you begin to hear about the secular city. And they are unheavenly cities. These cities are Babylon by choice. They are sick cities. And home is a dirty street in these sick cities. So is there hope for this city? Well, yes, if there is a church that takes on trouble. And if there are those who dare to love the ghetto. Because there is an urban challenge. We need to take our cities for God. We need to send apostles to the cities from the Jerusalem suburbs. They're going to be the change agents in these cities. We're going to unleash them into the world with their skinny jeans. And they will form an unstoppable force to do greater things in our cities, because greater things have yet to come. Greater things have yet to be done in the city. Yay, 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 yay. Whose gaze determines what the city looks like? Whose gaze determines what the suburbs look like? It is the racialization and the nationalization of the image of God. I'll offer one more example. The story of African American evangelicals. And this story is an interesting one that is very underrepresented. I was mentioning earlier that the last time I was at the Wheaton Theology Conference, I was here by accident. I was actually upstairs in the archives doing some research, came down and saw friends of mine here, and I said, "What are you doing here?" "We're here for the Wheaton Theology Conference." So that's the other time that I've been at this conference accidentally. But I was doing research on African American evangelicals. And I was looking specifically at the emergence of the National Black Evangelical Association. And I don't know if this is true now, but 4 years ago when I was doing research on this topic, there was one folder on the National Black Evangelical Association. One small, thin folder on the NBEA. So it shows that this is an underrepresented story within the story of evangelicals, because that story is oftentimes dominated by white evangelicals. There are a couple of reasons for this, and Ed Gilbreth, who wrote a book called Reconciliation Blues, and A.G. Miller, who teaches at Oberlin, they both look at one. You have to kind of look at the fact that it begins with the exclusion of the historic black churches from the evangelical narrative. Now, if you were to examine the theological foundations of the historic black church, the main theological assertions of the historic black church, compare it to the evangelical theology, you would find pretty much the same theology. But historically, sociologically, we very rarely consider historic black churches as part of the evangelical story. So, there is another part of the story, though, that there are African Americans who self-identified as evangelicals and actually asserted a very strong evangelical identity apart from the historic black churches. And this group emerges in the 1960s and 1970s. And one of the key forms of that expression was the National Black Evangelical Association, started in 1963. I want to talk about the different threads within the denomination, within that movement, and then talk specifically about the role of Tom Skinner and his role in this as in the historical context. One of the main threads of the National Black Evangelical Association was the Nottage brothers, who were a part of the Plymouth Brethren movement in the Bahamas, came to the United States and started planting churches in major urban centers, especially New York, and then eventually in places like Detroit. The Plymouth Brethren, as many of you know, are very fundamentalist, dispensationalist, very conservative theologically. We would identify the Plymouth Brethren with a very conservative theology. The Nottage brothers kind of formed their own group, the Black Brethren, who were found mostly in these urban centers. Bill Pinnell, who is now at Fuller Seminary, would be one of those who came out of this tradition in Detroit among the Black Brethren. One of the first important threads of the National Black Evangelical Association were staunchly fundamentalist, staunchly conservative theologically. A second thread are African American Pentecostals, and one of the key leaders of that would be William Bentley and his wife Ruth Bentley. Both are part of a Trinitarian Pentecostal denomination. The strength of these denominations is that they held to a conservative theology, but at the same time they held their own, they had their own kind of network. They were not under the control of white denominations. They had their own network of Black Pentecostal churches, but again held to a conservative evangelical theology. The third thread would be the African Americans, especially post-World War II, who would attend evangelical institutions, who attended Wheaton College, Moody Bible Institute, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, Fuller Theological Seminary, Gordon Conwell, etc. These pioneering African Americans would have their theological education formed and shaped in the context of these very strongly evangelical institutions. So if you were to look at their degrees, you would say they have very strong evangelical credentials. They're graduates of our evangelical institutions. They were relatively small in number, but they were very influential in the formation of the NBEA. The NBEA provided a place where those who held to an evangelical theology could go to a place with other African American evangelicals to talk about the issues that they were dealing with at these evangelical institutions. Many of them would go on to serve in evangelical parachurch organizations like InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Youth for Christ, Campus Crusade for Christ. So this third thread, if you were to look at their resume, you would say from top to bottom, they were strongly evangelical credentials. They went to Wheaton. They worked for Youth for Christ. They had the same credentials as Billy Graham. Some of them even worked for Billy Graham. So you have these African American evangelicals. You look at their story. You look at their resume. You could say very clearly, these are dyed-in-the-wool, from top to bottom, credentialed evangelicals. They are card-carrying evangelicals. The problem, though, is that as these African American evangelicals began to explore not only the foundation of their evangelical theology, but began to explore a Black national identity, an identity outside of white evangelicalism, they were called into question. And maybe the best example of that is Tom Skinner. Tom Skinner, as many of you know, in fact, gave one of the most stirring talks in Wheaton Chapel ever here in 1969. Tom Skinner is kind of a great example of Black evangelicalism in the 1960s and 70s. He grew up in a historic Black church in Harlem. In fact, his father was a preacher at a historic Black church. He was the son of a preacher, but he was also leading a double life. He was the president of his youth group. He was the president of a Shakespeare club. He was a straight-A student, but he was also a gang leader. And he had kind of disavowed Christianity in some form, even though on the surface he was a good church kid. Tom Skinner was about to enter into a huge gang war. And he was getting ready to lead his gang. He was a gang leader, lead his gang into this war, into this battle the next day. And as he was preparing for this battle, he hears a radio program. And it is a radio evangelist preaching the gospel. And somehow through that preaching of the gospel, through the radio program, Tom Skinner becomes an evangelical Christian, commits his life to Christ, and he has this amazing testimony. He goes to the gang. He says, I'm leaving the gang. They don't beat him out. He actually is able to leave the gang unscathed. And then he becomes this tremendous evangelist on the streets of Harlem. Rents out Apollo Theater and rents out these places, travels in New York City, and becomes this powerful evangelist. So he has this amazing testimony. I was a church kid who everybody thought was the good kid, but I was really a bad gang leader. And then I heard this radio program, And I converted to Christianity through this evangelistic radio program, and now I'm an evangelist for the kingdom of God. So that you can imagine evangelicals hearing that and says, this is the story we want to get out there. This is the narrative of a personal conversion, the narrative of someone who was once a bad kid, now a good kid. That's the greatest evangelical testimony ever told. And he was trotted out in a number of different contexts to tell that story. Other evangelists would bring him along and say, you can have the one multi-ethnic night and you'll speak at the one multi-ethnic night. And oftentimes those are the best attended evangelistic crusades. He even got a spot on radio, on Christian radio. And again, the main thing he would do is share his powerful personal testimony and use the evangelism tools that are often very common in that time, the altar calls, those kinds of things that we associate with evangelism. So Skinner was embraced by the white evangelical world, by the main evangelical world. He was asked to come to speak at the Wheaton colleges. He was given a radio spot on Moody Radio. He was embraced by the white evangelical world until he begins to speak about justice issues, social justice issues, and particularly racial justice issues. So during the time that Tom Skinner could approximate whiteness, approximate mainstream white evangelical Christianity, there was a broad embrace of Skinner's ministry. But as he begins to shift the focus of his talks and his Christian college presentations, in 1969 here at Wheaton and in 1970 at the Urbana Missions Conference, he is less and less embraced by the majority culture evangelicals. Radio stations drop him. Christian colleges stop inviting him. He talks about the history of oppression of Black America. He talks about the history of oppression within the church, and I don't have time to read through a lot of these quotes. They'll be in the paper, but you see over and over again Skinner now beginning to raise this question of racial justice, and the radio station no longer calls him. Christian colleges no longer call him. Now, there is question about, well, he was divorced in the early part of the 1970s. That is true. But what I'm finding is that he was pushed out of evangelicalism way before the divorce actually occurred. That was the final seal. That made it a done deal. But even before the divorce occurred, there was already the rumblings, he's not one of us. He doesn't fit. Because salvific viability is tied in to approximation of whiteness. And he had stopped doing that. So who gets to determine whose gaze is normative? Whose perspective determines who is made in the image of God and who is not? Who is acceptable and who is not? I will close with some things maybe we can do as we move forward. As we move forward, as I've written in other contexts about the changing face of American Christianity, the changing face especially of American evangelicalism, that more and more churches are becoming not just multi-ethnic, but also we're seeing that white evangelicalism is in decline, but it is the growth of the Korean American churches, the African American churches, the Spanish-speaking congregations. That has been the redemptive work of God in the last 10, 15 years of maintaining the church in America, mainly through non-white expressions of faith here in the United States. But the question remains, even as the demographics of American society and American churches change, have the power dynamics changed? Do we still live in a world where the dominant gaze is still with the dominant culture? Do we still live in a world where what is defined as normal theology is still defined as Western white theology? Do we still live in a world where conferences highlight white Christian pastors as the example to follow? Do we still live in a world where faculty of Christian colleges are overwhelmingly white? Do we still live in a world where denominational leadership is still overwhelmingly white, even though that is not the reality of the church we live in? So I ask the question once more, whose gaze will determine the narrative of American evangelicalism going forward? Thank you.